Hello everyone and welcome back to another installment from our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Today's webinar centres around lifecycle assessment and how it impacts and has become part of the business strategy for New Zealand electricity provider and distributor Orion. thinkstep-anz's very own CEO Barbara Nebel is today's host, and she speaks to Orion's sustainability lead Pip Newland and Lifecycle Engineer Josh Pope. They talk about the types of power poles they tend to use, and what I found really interesting is how Orion is going about their reuse stage. Here's a sneak preview.
Conclusions for us was actually that the installation phase is where we can have the greatest impact. Another sort of fun thought experiment was if we decided to reduce our fuel usage over the next 10 years, what would that equate to in carbon reduction? And that was 324,000 tonnes. And I think I worked that out as approximately something like I could drive to the moon and back in one of our operator vehicles. And
so getting an accurate emissions factor associated with those assets is half the battle, and so that's part of what the LCA can actually help towards in terms of looking at that embodied carbon calculation.
Classic example, we had a high school the other day building a slackline course in their backfield, so we redirected some poles there.
This webinar can serve as a very good blueprint of how the LCA process can positively affect business strategy and lead to a more sustainable future. With that, let's get started.
Hello everyone to today's webinar, another webinar in our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Today we'll be talking about LCA, and we have two guest speakers from Orion. My name's Barbara, I'm CEO of ThinkStep Australia and New Zealand, and I'm your host today for the next 30 minutes. I'd like to welcome Pip Newland and Josh Pope, both from Orion. Pip is sustainability lead and Josh is lifecycle engineer. Together they are in the sustainability team at Orion. Pip is working more on the strategy side of things, while Josh is in the engineering team, and jointly they're working very hard to make sustainability, to integrate it into business as usual at Orion. Very much looking forward to hearing from them in a moment about how they're using LCA to do that. Before I hand over to you, I might just have a few words about LCA and what lifecycle thinking, lifecycle assessment is all about. I think it's quite simple. It's about avoiding solving one problem by creating another. And we do that by looking at all processes from cradle to grave, finding raw materials, manufacturing, distribution, use, and if possible, recycling to close the loop. We will today hear about one particular use of LCA, but there are quite a few other useful applications of LCA. One is because we look at that full life cycle to identify risks and environmental hotspots during the life cycle of a product. It provides robust data to make decisions. It gives you also data to communicate results, reduce your environmental impacts. While you go through data collection, you really engage with your supply chain. And you can use results to also develop policies and strategies. When we say we look at the whole life cycle, it means we can ideally quite easily see where the main impacts are. For example, for a number of products, you can see distribution really is only a tiny amount. For other products, distribution can be quite significant. And you have other impacts, like, for example, storage. It really depends on what product you're looking at. You can see what stage of the life cycle is most important. If you want to use it for decision making, for example, in a roading example, we're using virgin crushed rock versus recycled aggregate. You can do comparisons, as in if you use recycled aggregate, we could, for example, transport that for an extra 5 kilometers, but beyond that, it might not make sense. So that is where you can use it in decision making. But it also goes beyond carbon. We look at quite a range of environmental impacts. I won't go into them in a lot of detail, but most importantly is we don't want to optimize carbon, but at the same time increase water use quite a lot, because we really need to look after all of those. And here you can see just 6 different products. You can see most options, the blue option isn't great, but for water scarcity, it is really the gray option. So depending on what you want to improve most, you need to look at a number of indicators, because you can't really decide, do we want to look more after our turtles or our polar bears? That's why we need to look at a range of environmental impacts. That's it from me to give you a bit of a flavor on what LCA is all about. And now I'll hand over to Pip and Josh.
Okay, so I thought I would start off thanks to Barbara for inviting us along to sort of have a chat about this. And I thought I would just start off quickly by discussing just a kind of a 101 quickly on Orion and who we are and what we do. So we own and operate the distribution infrastructure that delivers electricity to our community in Christchurch and central Canterbury. So that's about 204,000 homes and businesses across the region, and a community owned by the Christchurch City Council and the Selwyn District Council. And our network is both rural and urban, and it extends across about 8,000 square kilometres across central Canterbury. So from the Waimak to the north to the Rakaia in the south, and from the coast right up to Arthur's Pass. So it means we've got quite a diverse range of areas that we cover, both urban and rural. And what it also means is that we have a lot of these. Poles are a really good example of a wider impact that we have as a network, because they're a long-lived asset, about 40 to 50 years on average. Some of them are longer. And this is an attribute that's shared by a lot of the assets that we use. And there's also a few different options for poles that we can use. So it makes sense to understand the life cycle effects of each of them when we're designing our network, and when we're thinking about what we want to prioritise in our procurement strategy. So just to provide a bit of context, this is our sustainability framework, and we'd identified responsible consumption and production as one of our priority areas. And sort of summarising our action in this space is working on how we consume so we can kind of learn and help others. So we're working towards a low carbon circular future with a resilience achieved not on isolated items, but actually as a network, as an organisation, and co-created with our community. So we talk a little bit about sustainability and design at Orion, and sustainability and design on our network, and how we might best enable that. So to start with, in our lifecycle team, we started out with a gap analysis to identify the information that we hold on the impact of the assets that we have. We gather a lot of data on the performance of assets in situ, but we lack a bit of insight into the cradle to gate and the end of life impacts once assets leave our network. So we've got a bit of data there, but not as much as we'd like. And I should note that the data that we gather on performance isn't always geared towards environmental impact. It's often more about kind of reliability and resilience and that kind of thing. So there's a bit of information that we can improve on in there as well. And developing understanding there is really helpful. So the long-term goal of bringing in LCA was to gain evidence-based insight into our impacts and when they occur during the asset life cycle. And that was to enable better decisions on how we design our network, because if we want to be truly circular, we need to think about the life cycle impact of an asset at the time we're thinking about kind of designing it in, not leave kind of legacy disposal issues for future Orion to deal with. Quickly gets pretty exciting when you think about what a future network might look like, and how you might facilitate a change towards that future network by properly comparing impacts between, say, poles and lines versus, I don't know, distributed generation or that kind of thing, and actually make the comparison between the two in terms of how you design. And it also has an impact for us in terms of the assets that we purchase, how they're installed and they're dealt with while they're on the network, because we have a lot of control in this area through the tendering process and the standards and specifications of what we design in, and also at the end of life. So when it's taken off, what do we ask contractors to do at that point? So practically, we're looking at a couple of places where this will start to come in. So we're currently working on improving reporting internally on sustainability indicators. So for example, carbon, and long term, this information will be tagged back to individual assets along with other reporting. So Josh will talk a bit more about this, but I'm interested in how we can kind of compare the performance of assets in differing locations within differing site configurations and easily kind of spot patterns or differences in particular design decisions. And it's particularly interesting when you're looking at how the network adapts to future climate impacts. We start to examine how we design our network and schedule maintenance in differing locations. So while our reporting's improving, we need a proxy for some of those environmental effects of assets, and that's where the LCA comes in. So it enables a proper comparison of options now at the front end of a design decision. So in the instance of poles, it means that we can actually focus our attention in the right area when we're actually deciding what we want to buy in the future. So this year, we're putting together a sustainable procurement strategy and properly understanding the impact of an asset, in this instance poles, enables us to focus on the behaviours we want to encourage or discourage through that strategy. And that's particularly useful right now when it comes to end-of-life strategy for poles in particular, because we want to encourage reuse and we want to discourage burning at the end of life. So it's kind of, yeah, it can be as simple as that. And I was really lucky to have Josh to lean on in this process. So I'll pass over to him to talk about kind of how we approached it in practice and what we learned as we went through.
I will just more or less run through why we chose poles, what we did with the poles, some of the assumptions we had leading into it, and sort of go through the conclusions. We chose the poles because they've got sort of a relatively discrete category of assets. You know, they are split between hardwood, softwood, and concrete poles. Within those three categories, there's different variations, but we sort of had to pick an average of each one of those, I suppose, and make some assumptions there to get some figures. A relatively short supply chain as well. Our furthest supplier is Australia, so the hardwoods come from Australia, the softwoods are here in New Zealand, and so are the concrete poles. And during that replacement program, and if there was any changes that we needed to make or anything we'd sort of missed that we hadn't quite seen in a wider scope of things, now's a good time to identify those. So we want to understand our environmental impact, to identify where improvements can be made, and leading into it, some of the assumptions that we had was that the end of life uses was going to be where we were going to see the most impact. So we had a real focus in that space. This is quite high level, and I haven't put too much of the detail of the actual LCA in here at all. It's more, I suppose, what we wanted in the results. But for us, the wooden poles are carbon negative, especially when they're reused and recycled. So there's more carbon sequestered during the growth of the poles than is produced over the lifetime of the pole, whether it's through maintenance or shipping or installation. The concrete poles for us, we don't actually install a lot of concrete poles, but if we were to install them, the greatest contributor towards carbon is mostly from the production stages. There's actually for concrete poles, there's quite a significant amount of extra labour during the installation phase of that as well, so a bit more fuel usage and that sort of stuff from contractors. All the benefits for the wooden poles are lost when burning is the end-of-life option, and that's kind of just been highlighted to us actually just recently. When we did the LCA, we were sort of forced to take a look at the procurement stage, the maintenance, the operational life, and the end of life. And during that end of life, we actually did find that some of the contractors were burning a lot of the untreated timber poles. So we're sort of navigating that minefield at the moment, but being able to have some information there to back up the importance of that and understand the impact that that's actually having helps to have a bit of an adult conversation, I suppose, with some of the contractors about, hey, do you guys realise that this is the impact that burning those poles has? There's a bit of a social side to that as well, which we need to try and navigate, but it's really good to have that information in hand to help reinforce some of those decisions. Conclusions for us was actually that the installation phase is where we can have the greatest impact towards reducing our carbon, which was quite a surprise to us, but it's an area that we have a lot of influence over, and there could be some work there to either optimize the way we're doing some of the work, or we could look at potentially biofuels and that sort of thing. For the concrete poles, the options there to discuss some lower carbon concrete mixes with our suppliers. And yeah, again, that last point there, carbon was a priority for us. So discouraging the burning of poles and encouraging more of that reuse was quite important to us. And so last year, for our pole installation overall in total, so looking at the fuel usage and all that sort of stuff, and the shipping to get the poles here, we're actually carbon negative for the amount of poles that we installed. So it was 319 tonnes. Another sort of fun sort of thought experiment was if we decided to reduce our fuel usage over the next 10 years, what would that equate to in carbon reduction? And that was 324,000 tonnes. And I think I worked that out as approximately something like I could drive to the moon and back in one of our operated vehicles and around the earth twice or something. It was quite a bit of fuel usage. So making those small differences and understanding those impacts can actually benefit the business in more ways than one. That's cost savings and fuel, and that could be time, and then also the benefits for the environmental side of things as well. How are we using the LCAs? Yeah, there's a bit of work around our data at the moment. It would be great to be able to capture some of this information and store it directly against the assets, but until we're sort of at that point in time, it's really good to have the LCA information available to us, so we can direct or manage some of those decisions that we're making, and as I say, have some of those conversations perhaps with our contractors, because we've got facts there to be able to back up those conversations. And what we'd like to do is build a bit of a suite of LCAs for our assets. At the moment, we've only done it for poles, but it would be good to do it for a few other things that we prioritise, and we can see where we could actually start to make have the biggest impact, so we can start to prioritise action. So while no direct actions have come out of this LCA just yet, it actually has helped reinforce some of the decisions that we're already making and guiding us along the right path, I suppose. Yeah.
So it really just confirmed for us, I think the main thing, what triggered it for us was the fact that we did have that big replacement program coming up. So we needed to know the impact of all the poles that were coming off the network, and how to guide our purchasing decisions as we were looking at what we were going to buy to put onto the network. And it kind of we tend to use wooden poles anyway, and so it just confirmed to us that was kind of the right decision that we were making for our purposes. And that at that end of life, I mean, it's a pretty simple message, but it was really just that it helped us focus our attention on the fact that we want to encourage that reuse, and that we need to start thinking about how we can introduce that into our procurement strategy and have those conversations with the contractors, and discourage the burning of those hardwood poles. I mean, that's it's a funny one, that one, because it's a time limited issue, because the hardwood poles are now treated, and so when we're kind of talking about it, we're like, well, how big of an issue is it? And then we kind of ran the figures, and it was about, I think it was
132,000 tonnes.
Yeah. So it was a big enough issue that we're like, oh, this is something we really need to think about, and it is something that we were thinking about how to approach it, and the best way to have that conversation, and definitely having the data behind it to have that adult conversation about this is the impact that we're having, and can you help us come up with a solution that means that you're still meeting your needs in terms of heating your houses and that kind of thing, but also that we're not having that impact long term has been really helpful. So I didn't have too much else to add, really. It's just been it was a really interesting exercise to go through, and something I'm really keen to go through with other assets, because it really underscored where we were making assumptions. Because I thought the end of life would be a bigger issue for us across the board, rather than just a simple step. And just in terms of where and the fact that the installation process was actually somewhere where we needed to kind of focus our efforts. And that then leads into kind of our carbon handprint strategy, and where we need to start thinking about how we start bringing that aspects of that into our engagement with contractors and our procurement strategy. So yeah, it's been very helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. We already have a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is, how are you reusing the wooden poles?
So they go to a few different places. We try to redirect some of them towards community projects and things like that. The contractors are always real keen to help out in that aspect. Classic example, we had a high school the other day building a slackline course in their backfield, so we redirected some poles there. Farmers are quite keen on using them for like straining posts and things like that. So while a lot of the poles coming off the network are no longer good for our purposes, there is still some good timber left in them, up to some sort of length. A lot of them are sort of about 9 meters long, but you might get some of them where there's still sort of 5 meters good timber left. A lot of farmers are quite keen to use those for straining posts, things like that. That's just some of the reuse. The Christchurch Adventure Park's quite keen to pick some up and use some for building some of their tracks. A lot of things like that. At the moment, it's predominantly managed by the contractors about where these poles go, but we're taking a bit more ownership in that and trying to redirect some of those poles towards a few more of those community type projects and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't necessarily have to be as our involvement doesn't have to be dictating where it goes. It's just kind of encouraging that it goes towards a reuse rather than a destruction scenario.
The other thing as well, there's a lot of some timber millers pick it up and reuse the untreated hardwood, the Australian hardwoods. There's a lot of good heartwood left in some of those poles, so it's a bit of work for those guys, but it's what they do and they love, so they don't mind milling that timber back down. So it can go into sort of furniture making. Some artists pick up a lot of it as well. Make sort of projects out of it. So,
Pony clubs use them for jumping poles and and what is actually would be really interesting long term is that typically what happens is, as we say, we've left it to the contractors to kind of take care of that kind of thing, but actually to track the categories of use that it goes to and be able to get some really good insight into kind of the social good, I suppose, that comes out of reuse.
We do have a few more questions. Thank you for that. Paul is asking, how are you accounting for wood preservative, and are wood poles difficult to reuse or recycle due to rotting or contamination? I guess some of that was already answered, but if you have something to add, especially for the preservative.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mixture of some of the poles that come off the network. Some of them are, like I say, hardwood untreated, and they are generally the oldest poles that we have on the network. So there's a lot of those coming off at the moment. There's not too many of the older treated ones that come off. There is some CCA treated poles coming off the network. Hope you might have a better idea of some of the work that's gone into that. Am I right in saying that a lot of that treatment has leached out over time? And
I think you're thinking of the creosote poles. What tended to happen with the creosote ones was that they did leach over time, but they're no longer used on the network. That's a kind of a legacy issue that we've had to deal with. So now the more modern treatments, I think they've done testing around the poles to assess how much comes out, and it's not as the same degree of issue, and so the reuse of them at the end of life is actually they're still fine to use in aspects of for example, like strainer posts or like the adventure park and that kind of thing. That's not so much of an issue anymore. That's probably about as much as I can add in that instance. It was a tricky one. It's an interesting one because when you looked at the environmental effects across the life cycle, I mean, carbon was a big priority for us, but then the environmental effects associated with the wooden poles versus the concrete, the treatment does start becoming an issue in there, but it's so far outweighed by the carbon benefits that at least in the shorter term, we decided to focus our efforts on the carbon benefits that came out of it, and then think about managing the environmental effects of treatment rather than discounting them.
Yeah, maybe one of the other questions that was in there actually was, what are we doing with the treated poles that do come off the network? Some of them are just going to landfill. It's actually just a better option for us to let them break down over time than do anything else if we can't find anything else. So that's sort of the last resort in that instance. Yeah.
Yes.
If in the scenario where they do go to landfill, we have apportioned some of the degradation,
Yes.
and we look at the methane emissions coming from that as well, so that is included.
Yeah.
One other question is, did the carbon calculation include the shorter life of wooden poles over concrete?
Yes, I suppose in short. So yeah. So I think the concrete poles we'd looked at, was it 80 years, Josh?
80 years,
and then, and then the wooden poles were like between 40 and 50 years.
And we looked at the number of recycling, replacement cycles that were needed.
Yeah. So it's right sized, I think, when you're comparing the effects across the different categories, so that you're actually comparing apples with apples rather than looking at a skewed result.
There are two more. One is, are you going to include poles in your business emissions calculations? I guess that is leaning towards a scope 3 type question.
And it's a good one, actually. When we did our initial scope 3 calculations we did for our benchmark year in 2018, I looked at the embodied carbon in network assets that were installed in a particular year. And poles was probably one of the easier. And actually, I think because we didn't have this life cycle information at the time, they were actually an emission rather than a negative result. And so that would obviously alter that result now. But poles are probably the easiest in that scenario, because with the other network assets, the supply chain associated with them is quite long and difficult. So getting an accurate emissions factor associated with those assets is half the battle. And so that's part of what the LCA can actually help towards in terms of looking at that embodied carbon calculation.
I should add that to more users of the LCA to help us with carbon reporting.
Yeah.
And the final question is from Jake, saying, thank you, Pip and Josh. When you say installation is the greatest carbon impact, what is the contribution of the foundations? Was that included?
That could be my fault there. I may have worded that wrong. It wasn't the greatest impact in terms of carbon, but it was where we could have the most influence, I suppose, in changing, or the most impact for us to be able to change, if that makes sense.
They were brought into the calculation, though, because we did have that discussion. And I think part of with the concrete around the foundations, that it's not used in every instance, potentially.
No,
I could be talking. I'm out of my realms of experience here.
So we don't actually install any concrete poles at all. If we were to install them, they'd be for a very specific use that a timber pole most likely couldn't be used for. That would really be the only instance we would actually use one. In terms of installing the timber poles, we don't put any concrete around the base of them. We'll have heel and breast blocks. There'll be some AP40, AP30 and packed into there around the base of the pole, but there's no other concrete that goes into it. So I hope that's answered that question.
Well, thank you also from me for sharing your story, for answering all those questions. That was really useful to see also an LCA example from a user's point of view. Most often it is the manufacturers undertaking LCA studies. So it was really interesting to see how you are using those LCA studies. Thanks for sharing that with us.
It's all good.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Well, we have a few more webinars planned for November. So everyone else, we will send out invites. Let us know if you're interested. We talk about materiality assessment, TCFD reporting, environmental product declarations, and watch out for them. I wish you all a very nice afternoon. Thank you. Thanks again, Pip and Josh.